From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's today's lineup. K-State's Dan O'Brien will discuss the grain market reaction to the latest salvos in the U.S. China trade dispute. And Dan takes a closer look at the economic struggles of the ethanol industry during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz talks about the value of taking tissue samples from soybean plants for nutrient analysis. He says that can serve two purposes: as a way to monitor soybean crop nutrient uptake and as a means of diagnosing production issues in a given soybean field. And checking in later on for our look at Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're tuned to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you listening in once again. And we get into the grain market scene, first of all, right here, as we do each Friday with Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Well, it's been, to put it this way, Dan, a less than inspiring week on the grain trades, and as per this past day's trading, it's quite obvious now that the markets are prone to reaction to any news about the trade situation between the U.S. and China. And that certainly was played out yesterday as we saw the markets close with a thud in response to the latest developments there.
Yeah, I think, Eric, I'd almost say it's asymmetric in that they're inclined not to trust positive news, but at least in this case, really responded negatively to news that the latest set of talks between the U.S. administration and China weren't as successful as were hoped for, at least on the U.S. side, and that a 10% tariff was going to be imposed on another $300 billion in Chinese goods. They have the different sets and types of U.S. imports from China broken up into what they call tranches, and so they're heading for the fourth set now, I guess. So that was responded to negatively in the markets, and you see now in the ag press reports from various major agribusiness concerns, especially some reports from leadership of one of our major companies, ADM, that's talking about how, at least as in their perception, as their ethanol industries were going, that to not have this trade agreement with China dealt with in a positive manner is a, quote, drag on their hope for exports down the road. I think there are other issues involved right along with that, probably more at issue in terms of the challenges that the ethanol industry is having right now. But there's a lot of press that's come into play, and what I understand is that as you and I watch those CFTC position of traders reports that come out on a weekly basis, it sounds like that commercial traders took this latest news, and I wouldn't say it's in a panicky manner, but in a manner that delayed a lack of confidence. They must have sold off at least a portion of their positive positions and went to the bearish side. So it is as it is. There still are major issues to be dealt with, and really from here through the 12th of August, as the market anticipates what the USDA updated acreage report will give as it's released on that time. And again, those, now that we're into August, those surveys are being taken right now. So we'll see what those come out with. And again, the numbers, we're almost assumed to have a 10 million acre prevented planted situation, and we hear a lot of discussion of 13, 14, 15. So that will have to be dealt with along with some production issues creeping into parts of the U.S. Corn Belt. When you look at the last 7 to 10 days, actually the last 30 days of moisture, but especially the last week or so, pretty dry through almost everywhere in the U.S. Corn Belt. Only some parts of the central part of Minnesota, a little bit of South Dakota, some Missouri, that's not dry. Everything else pretty dry. And when you look at 30 days past, then some of those same areas in central Illinois, even eastern Iowa that were having planting problems, have been pretty dry relative to any rainfall that's coming. So there's going to be quite a lot of potential for movement in the markets, volatility, if you want to call it that, as we head off towards that August 12th report. And if there's a surprise in that report, then I think in the next week or so, as you and I watch these markets, it'd be good for us to talk about what a person can do to be wary of moves in either direction on this thing. And we probably need to be talking about the use of some put and call options just to have in place in case we start to really hop around in these markets.
And we'll come back to that. But picking up on something that you touched upon a moment ago, Dan, that is the economic woes in ethanol production right now. At least one media article getting into that question with the aforementioned leadership of ADM. You think that it's, as you said, beyond just the trade issues, the problems with the economics in ethanol production right now. It gets back to basic commodity economics, you think?
Well, as those plants are operating, if you look at what's happened to the price of ethanol, basically since June we've been sideways to somewhat higher. So that's a positive. Have come up from about $1.27, $1.30 per gallon up to about $1.45, $1.47. What's really jumped up that's affected their margins has been corn prices in those central Corn Belt areas, and well, in our areas too. But as cash price of corn has jumped up, it's really put a crunch on their profitability. We take these numbers from central Iowa and in that region and put them through a model plant and try to do that on a monthly basis just to monitor what's going on and understand the trends. And really you've got a situation where you haven't had profitability show up for these representative Iowa plants for about 11 or 12 months. It's about a year. And so here we do see some announcements now that plants are temporarily going offline. We see basically the July price at $1.47 by hour. By our numbers, the cost in July was $1.72 per gallon versus the price of $1.47. Net loss of about 25 cents a gallon, and that was just about the same or a little more than it was in the month of June. So pretty challenging times, and you see that in the face of what some of those eastern Corn Belt ethanol plants are anticipating in terms of a lot of prevented planted in their own neighborhood and some pretty tight input supplies, and very likely to be a very sparse, tough environment for a lot of those places, especially if they're not getting local supplies and they have to start shipping them in and paying those extra costs, then challenges we're seeing now would just be exacerbated as we head off into the fall and winter months of 2019 and 20 marketing year.
All right, then back to the other thing that you just said, and that was the expectation that we'll see volatility and then some in these markets as we move forward over the next several weeks, and suggesting that producers need to be, ready to take favorable positions in the options market as those positions are availed to the producer.
Yes, the markets, as we've seen, there's anticipation that we'll get tighter production numbers and reductions in that. So if you're a livestock feeder, then you're looking at call options to protect yourself from prices moving to the high side. Maybe up until this week, prices were 20, 30 cents higher for D's corn, some other new crop contracts. And we probably would have thought more at that time about buying put options to protect the lower side. At least right now, in my perspective, it doesn't seem like there's as much risk of that given the realities of that short supply situation that we're dealing with. I think in the last week, what's become clearer is that while we in the ag side are focused on the size of the crop and on the production aspects of things and on total supplies, the managed money, quote, spec traders and some others are as much focused on the demand weaknesses. It is interesting, we're spending a lot of time talking about this. We'll have to talk about wheat and soybeans next week, I guess. But when you look at new crop corn bids at ethanol plants, you're looking at 50, 60, 70 cent positive basis bids in those eastern Corn Belt locations. So that's saying, in their view, they're not caring where the futures are at. They've got to bid that much to try to get whatever corn's out there. So that's probably the real market, those higher cash bids in some of those eastern Corn Belt locations where they're really worried about supplies.
Well, we'll spare a moment here to get into the wheat market briefly. A bright spot in the markets right now, and with exports there doing comparatively well.
Yes, for hard red winter wheat, we had exports for the week ending July 25th of 8.7 million bushels. We need only about 7.2 to meet the USDA's projection, and that's running better than the U.S. as a whole. So strength for hard red, weakness in a couple of those other areas. Well, for hard red spring, white wheat, and others. So that's interesting. When you look at Kansas basis bids, in the eastern third of the state, at least looking at Topeka and Columbus, you've got the highest, strongest basis bid that we've had back to and through 2015. You go to central Kansas, again, over those last 5 years, we're near the narrowest of bids that we've had. When you come out to the west, southwest Kansas, we're doing okay for bids. Northwest, with large production numbers that we've had, and we tend to see a little bit more weakness in the northwest Kansas, but it's a supply-demand issue. We just had outstanding yields out here. So the futures for wheat are going up and down, and frankly, the futures for wheat are being affected by movement in the corn. So if people still have wheat in hand, then one thing to at least be aware of is that if we come into this crop report on August the 12th and there's a positive response in that market to corn, it very likely would affect wheat too. And if nothing else, if we do end up short of corn by a bit here in the U.S. in 2019, there'll be all that much more wheat feeding that will come in and be pulled into service to try to cover the shortfall on the feed grain side.
Dan, we appreciate the observations, and we'll hear from you again next Friday. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He's along with us each week to delve into the grain markets and what's pushing those trends. Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today returns in a few moments here on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today is back now. You soybean growers, we're now at an optimum point for you to think about assessing how your stands rate in terms of their nutrient content and availability. And there's a technique that we're going to talk up. It's called plant analysis, and along with us to talk more about it is crop nutrient specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz of K-State Research and Extension. Dorivar, this is beyond just a soil test. This is something that gives the producer an in-season idea of the status nutritionally of their crop, right?
Yes, Eric, that's really the main purpose of tissue testing. And we really have a couple main purpose for this analysis, and that can help us. The first one is really to find out what's the status in terms of nutrition for that crop, essentially to evaluate our fertility program and whether or not we need to be considering some adjustments, either in season in some cases or in some cases also thinking about fertility program in the future. So it's really kind of an assessment of what's the status, quality control, if you will, for this particular season. The second purpose for tissue analysis is typically for diagnostic purpose, and in this case, it's a situation where perhaps we have some problematic areas in the fields, crop that's not looking good, and we want to basically find out what's the limitation, what's the problem in that particular field. So those are two main use for tissue testing, and again, both are situations where we can get excellent information that can help us with managing fertility in soybeans in this case.
And the procedures here will differ depending on your intent here, as a monitoring tool or as a diagnostic tool, correct?
Yes, and that's very important, Eric, because if we're thinking about, especially if we're thinking about monitoring nutrient levels, there are a few factors that we have to keep in mind, because essentially what's going to happen in this case, we're going to collect tissue samples, we'll send it to the lab, and we'll get a report basically providing some ranges in terms of optimum levels or low levels or excessive levels in some cases for nutrients. So we really need to keep in mind the sampling methods, the timing of the sample, what plant parts we are collecting, and the growth stage of that crop. So in the case of soybean in particular, and again, this is something that will change for every crop, of course, because again, we need to be looking at those book values, those reference values for nutrient in the case of monitoring with tissue testing. And so in the case of soybean, the guidelines typically, like you mentioned earlier, we are getting now in the time of the year for soybeans where it's a good time for tissue testing. We typically want to do that, collect that sample between the R1 and R4 growth stage, basically between flowering and pod set. We don't want to collect samples much later than that because in the case of soybean, the nutrients will start to move in the pods, in the seeds, and of course will basically have lower nutrient concentration in the tissue. So again, this is really the optimum timing for collecting those samples. Now again, what part of the plants we are collecting is very important because again, depending on what parts of the plants you are collecting, we may have different concentration of nutrients. And in the case of soybean, we're talking the uppermost fully developed trifoliate without the petiole, and we typically want to collect between 20 and 30 samples around the field, so we have a representative sample. And so again, those are key points to keep in mind: the timing, the growth stage, and the sampling methods for soybeans in this case. Once we have those samples, we also have to be careful in terms of how we handle those samples as we are preparing to send that to the lab. And one thing that is very important is we don't want to put it maybe in a plastic bag. Ideally, we want to use paper bags. In that way, basically, those samples start to dry as we are, again, sending it to the lab. Once we get it to the lab, essentially what we'll do is we'll dry it and grind it. So again, if we can start to that process of drying as soon as we collect it by placing it in clean paper bags, that's really ideal situation for those samples.
So those are the steps to follow. But Dorivar, what should a grower be seeking from this analysis? What nutrients do they want to measure for, so to say?
Yes, and this could be also a little confusing in many cases. And of course, we can look at all the nutrients, and many producers may be evaluating all the macro and micronutrients. But in the case of soybean in particular, for us here in Kansas, I will definitely focus on the main ones, NP and K, and also consider sulfur, zinc, and iron. Those are usually the ones that we tend to see more limitations in many cases, and the ones that we need to monitor closely. Other micronutrients, for the most part, we don't have significant issues, and again, this also becomes less reliable for some of those micros that are not very commonly used. And so, again, I will focus definitely on the NP and K, sulfur, zinc, and iron for us here in Kansas. And I mentioned nitrogen, and you will say, well, this is a legume, we shouldn't have an issue. But in fact, a nitrogen test in the tissue could give us an indication of how well that soybean is basically fixing nitrogen. In other words, the activity of the nodules, which again, it could be important in especially new ground soybean that may be moving to fields that we didn't have a long history of soybean in the past. And so again, that could give us an indication of how good of a job that soybean is doing in terms of fixing nitrogen as well. So it is important in the case of tissue and monitoring purpose in this case.
Now, the results would come back to the grower, and typically they may provide what's called a sufficiency range for that given nutrient. Explain that, if you will.
Yes, and this is, again, I mentioned earlier, book values or sufficiency ranges, essentially, and these are values that were basically developed based on what a healthy soybean will basically have in terms of nutrient content at that growth stage, and using those specific plant parts. Again, in terms of what you will get from the soil testing lab or any lab that you're submitting these tests, you will get these sufficiency ranges values, and essentially we can compare our samples to those sufficiency ranges and evaluate where we are in terms of nutrient content. And again, that's where we can evaluate. In some cases, maybe we have some nutrients that are a little bit lower, and we have to maybe start to explore that a little bit more and see what's happening in that case. It's also important to keep in mind that nutrient deficiency can happen because we don't have sufficient nutrients in the soil, which is what we're trying to find out. But there are also some other factors that can affect nutrient concentration in the plant, and these will be things like poor root development, pest problems, anything that can affect nutrient uptake will basically show in that nutrient concentration in the tissue test. So we have to keep that in perspective also when we are looking at that report. Sometimes we look at low levels of some nutrients, and we may be thinking about immediately applying fertilizer for this crop or future crops, but we have to explore a little bit also what's the status of that crop. Do we have any problems in terms of compactions or any other issues happening in the field before we consider any fertilizer application in that particular case?
That blends over into the other purpose of a plant analysis, and that is using it as a diagnostic tool. And if that is one's intent, do they go about sampling any differently then, Dorivar?
Yes, and again, that's the second use for tissue testing. Again, very popular, and I get this very often from agronomists, particularly trying to figure out basically what may be the problem. And in this case, the sampling protocol is different. We may have actually a little bit more flexibility in terms of timing of the year and plant parts that we're trying to collect, because in this case, what we typically try to do is basically to compare values from good areas and bad areas of the field. In other words, do we have parts of the field that's having some problems? We want to collect samples from there and compare that to the same field, but maybe some plants that are looking healthier. And we want to make that comparison to find out what's that limiting factor, what's that limiting nutrient causing that problem. And in this case, again, in terms of sampling protocol, we do have a little bit more flexibility. We can essentially collect samples anytime during the growing season, because in this case, we are not trying to compare these values to that sufficiency ranges. We're really just trying to compare good areas and bad areas and trying again to figure out what's that limiting factor.
So you don't have to wait until the plant is flowering necessarily.
We don't have to wait necessarily until the plant is flowering. If we do see some deficiency problem or problems early in the season, we can essentially collect whole plants. If the plant's still small enough, we can collect small plants. And again, good areas and bad areas. And this is very important. We have to collect both to make that comparison if we're trying to basically use it for diagnostic. If we're getting to this stage of this part of the year, we can still also follow the same approach in terms of collecting the uppermost fully developed trifoliate. But again, always comparing those good areas and bad areas as we ultimately try to compare this nutrient content in the plant as, again, trying to find out what's that limiting factor. One thing to keep in mind also in this case is that it could be very useful to also collect soil samples along with these tissue samples if we are talking about diagnostic, anything that can help us to find out what's causing problems in that particular part of the field. It will be useful. And again, in this case, soil testing will be important as well. So again, if we are looking at soil tests, we can find out whether that nutrient is present in the soil. And on the other hand, looking at tissue testing, we can find out whether or not that crop basically is taking up that nutrient that we have in the soil. So again, having those pieces of information can help us fine-tune and figure out what's the limiting factor in that case.
Dorivar, thanks for going over the procedure right here.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. There is an article on this particular topic available to you in the Agronomy E-Update series. It was posted this past Friday, July the 26th, on plant analysis for testing nutrient levels in soybeans. Check that out at agronomy.ksu.edu. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Now for you on Agriculture Today, the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, as climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State Research and Extension is aboard once again to visit about Kansas agricultural weather. And we'll provide the latest on the torrential rainfall in eastern Kansas the past 24 hours or so, Mary, but you do have the wrap-up for the month of July. And it was certainly drier than the month of June, surely, wasn't it?
Drier than the month of June, and of course drier than May was. Actually, the statewide average was quite a bit below normal. We averaged 2.5 inches, which is about 66% of normal. The only division that was above normal was the Southeast Division. They were 119% of normal with an average of 4.66 inches. So the Southeast really could not get a break. They were pretty much continued problems with that excess moisture. The driest area, not surprisingly, was on the opposite end of the state in the northwest corner. They averaged 1.37 inches, which is about 38% of normal. That puts that northeast corner behind for the year and behind for the growing season, but they're still at 95% of the normal for that area. And they had their rains in a fairly timely manner, distributed fairly well, so they're not seeing the negative impacts that are actually showing up in parts of central Kansas.
And that's important to keep the perspective. You need to look back beyond this past month because of all the surplus moisture that took place earlier in the year. But you say there is that pocket that is now being considered as quasi-droughty?
Right. It's officially termed abnormally dry, and that is a pocket in the central areas of the state, which we're considering like Edwards, Pawnee County, Reno County, in that particular region. They were dry for July. They were also dry in June, and not as excessively wet in May, although they were above normal. So what they're facing is that top 4 to 8 inches of soils are drying really quickly. The rooting systems on the crops in that area were compromised by the wet conditions, so you're beginning to see some pretty significant stress due to that. Again, if you go for a week without any precipitation, it can be bad, but if you go for 6 weeks without any, it's beginning to create problems.
And to cap off the July story, temperatures about where they would normally be for any given July?
Right. Actually, we, as a state, averaged 1/10 of a degree cooler than normal. And given
some would call that negligible.
Right. And given the variability that we have in our temperatures, if you're 1/10 of a degree cooler than normal, or for that matter, warmer than normal, you're right in the middle of the range of the distribution. Really, really close to what we would statistically call an average July.
Well, the month of August has opened up wet. In the eastern part of the state, extraordinarily so. The prediction had been, Mary, as we talked about the August outlook in previous weeks, for a wetter than normal August, but not with the intention of the entire expected moisture happening the first day of the month.
Right. The updated August outlook was released on July 31st, and it favored wetter than normal statewide, with the best chance for wetter than normal in those eastern 3 divisions. We had reports, and we're still getting reports in, but reports of 11 inches before the rain gauge overtopped. So widespread reports of 7, 8, and 9 inches in that eastern area, particularly southern Douglas County and into Franklin County. And that was as of 7 a.m. on the 1st, not including what fell the rest of the day. And, of course, we're getting widespread rains today that will just add to that. Not the best for our producers to have it all at once. It would be a whole lot nicer to have a more typical August and have a better distribution of it. Not to say that we're going to be dry for the rest of the month, but getting 2 or 3 times your normal precip in the first day is not a good way to get it.
Not at all. And, of course, leading to flood warnings and watches in the eastern third of the state. Now, this system is churning around, and you bring the latest quantitative precipitation forecast map, which tells us, Mary, that we have more in store for a fair part of the state.
Right. The quantitative precip forecast looks at not what's the probability of precip, but more how much are we expected to squeeze out of those probabilities. And basically, the eastern third of the state is expected to see anywhere from 4 to 10 inches starting today and going through next Friday.
That's starting today on top of the 7 to maybe as much as 11 inches that's already fallen.
Yes. So that is not including that very heavy rain that we had yesterday. This is expected to continue mostly through today and into tomorrow, and fairly unsettled in parts of next week. Basically, what's happening is we're having a very active monsoon season in the southwest, and that moisture is wrapping around almost like an inland storm, circling through Nebraska and then coming down through eastern Kansas.
But it does appear that there is marginal relief for that abnormally dry area in the central part of Kansas.
Right. They may see between a half an inch to maybe as much as an inch and a half, which would be very welcome, especially if it would be over several days rather than several hours. Again, long consistent rainfall will be more beneficial than getting it all at once.
But the next few days of rainfall around Kansas probably won't be the end for the month of August.
No, at this point, the outlook continues to favor wetter than normal. Right now, with the active monsoon, there's not anything that would really signal a rapid switch into a dry pattern.
Mary, we appreciate your time. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. Likewise, thanks to you for tuning in. Please be back with us right here on Monday, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.